Imagine this. You are standing on the rooftop of your flooded home. The water is rising. Your children are crying. Your neighbors are screaming for help. The roads are gone. The bridges are collapsed. Everything you have ever known is underwater or broken into pieces. You have no phone signal. You have no food. You have nothing left but hope. And then, out of the gray, churning sky, you hear it. A sound. A low, rhythmic thudding that grows louder and louder. And then you see it. A helicopter. And on the side of that helicopter, in clear white letters, you read those three words that change everything. United States Navy. That moment. That single, heart-stopping moment of rescue. That is what this story is about. For the last decade, from 2015 to 2025, the United States Navy has answered that call more times than most Americans will ever fully know. In earthquakes and hurricanes, in pandemics and typhoons, on coasts from Puerto Rico to Nepal to Southeast Asia, American sailors and naval forces have shown up. Not always with cameras rolling, not always with headlines, but always with helicopters, hospital ships, clean water, and the hands and hearts to help. Today, we're going to walk through that decade together. We're going to look at the real operations, the real ships, the real people, and the real moments that defined 10 years of the United States Navy as a global force, not just for war, but for healing. This is a story of sailors who traded weapons for water purifiers, of hospital ships that sailed into broken harbor cities not to fight, but to heal, of pilots who flew into mountain storms in Nepal and never came home, and of a Navy that, time and time again, proved that the most powerful force in the world can also be its most compassionate. Let's start at the beginning of this decade. Chapter 1. The Shaking Earth, Nepal, April 2015. The morning of April 25, 2015, started like any other morning in Kathmandu, Nepal. People were going to markets. Children were heading to school. Street vendors were setting up their stalls in the narrow lanes of one of Asia's most ancient and beautiful cities. And then, at 11:56 in the morning, the ground began to shake. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake, centered near the Gorkha district, tore through central Nepal with a force that geologists later described as catastrophic. The tremors lasted nearly a minute, but the destruction they left behind would last for years. Ancient temples that had stood for 500 years collapsed in seconds. Entire mountain villages simply ceased to exist. Landslides swallowed roads and homes whole. The United Nations later reported that more than 8 million people had been directly affected by the earthquake. At least 8,800 people lost their lives. Over 500,000 homes were destroyed or damaged. And in the remote mountain regions, entire communities were cut off completely, with no roads in, no roads out, and no way to get help. Now, the United States Navy is not just a fleet of ships. It is a global system of response capability. And within days of that earthquake, that system activated. U.S. Pacific Command launched what it named Operation Sayoji Hat. In Nepali, those words mean helping hands. And that name captured perfectly what was about to happen. Joint Task Force 505, led by the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, deployed to Nepal. About 900 United States military and civilian personnel were involved in the operation, with around 300 directly on the ground in Nepal. The task force brought with it a remarkable collection of military assets, including MV-22B Osprey tiltrotor aircraft, which are extraordinary machines capable of taking off and landing vertically like helicopters, but then tilting their rotors and flying at aircraft speeds. These Ospreys could fly directly into remote mountain regions that no conventional helicopter or aircraft could reach, land without needing a runway, and deliver vital supplies right where they were needed most. 3 Marine Corps UH-1Y Huey helicopters for MV-22B Ospreys, C-17 transport aircraft, and KC-130J Hercules planes flew continuous missions in and out of the disaster zone. The 36th Contingency Response Group, a rapid deployment airfield management unit operating out of Guam, set up operations at Kathmandu's Tribhuvan International Airport. In just 2 weeks, working alongside Nepalese soldiers, 42 airmen from that group, offloaded more than 4 million pounds of cargo from 80 aircraft. Military commanders at the time called it the most cargo their unit had ever downloaded in a single disaster relief operation. By May 10th, the Joint Task Force had delivered nearly 50 tons of relief supplies, transported 273 personnel, and logged almost 70 hours of flight time across the broken mountains and shattered valleys of Nepal. But here is where this story takes a turn that every American should know about. On May 12th, just over 2 weeks after the first earthquake, another massive tremor struck Nepal. A 7.3 magnitude aftershock hitting the same broken fault line in the same shattered region. And in the chaos and confusion of that second earthquake, a United States Marine Corps UH-1Y Huey helicopter, call sign S-08, went missing in the Cheriko region of the Himalayan mountains. That helicopter was on a relief mission. Its crew was out there in those mountains, trying to help. The Nepalese army searched for days. And on May 15th, they found the crash site. All 8 people on board had perished. 6 United States Marines and 2 Nepalese soldiers. Their names were Captain Dustin Lukashevitz, Captain Christopher Norjin, Sergeant Ward Johnson, Sergeant Eric Seaman, Corporal Sarah Medina, and Lance Corporal Jacob Hug. The Nepalese soldiers were Tapindra Raval and Bazana Tatara. These young men and this young woman did not die in combat. They died carrying food and medicine to strangers on the other side of the world. They died doing what the United States Navy and Marine Corps has always been willing to do, showing up when the world is broken, even when the cost is everything. The people of Nepal did not forget. Within days of the crash, an open letter from the people of Nepal was published and shared across the world, expressing grief and gratitude. The letter was later replied to by the United States ambassador to Nepal. In a land known for its spiritual depth, the sacrifice of those 8 souls was understood immediately for what it was, a gift given freely in service of humanity. Operation Sayoji Hot formally ended on May 26, 2015. The American task force had worked alongside more than 60 other nations. But it was the unique capabilities of United States Naval and Marine Corps aviation that had allowed relief to reach places no other country's assets could access. The earthquake in Nepal was the opening chapter of a decade that would test the United States Navy's humanitarian capabilities over and over again. Chapter 2, the year of 3 storms. Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, 2017. There are years that change things. There are years that break records and break hearts at the same time. And for the United States Navy, for FEMA, for the entire American emergency response system, 2017 was exactly that kind of year. In August and September of 2017, 3 catastrophic hurricanes struck the United States and its territories in brutal succession. Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. In terms of their combined cost, their combined destruction, and their combined human suffering, they represented one of the worst natural disaster sequences in recorded American history. Let's start with Harvey. Hurricane Harvey made landfall on August 25, 2017, on the Texas Gulf Coast near Corpus Christi as a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 130 miles per hour. But what made Harvey uniquely devastating was not just the wind. Harvey stalled over Houston for an entire week and dropped a year's worth of rain on the city in just days. 2 major water control reservoirs breached. Entire neighborhoods that had never flooded before were suddenly under 5, 6, 7 feet of water. 30,000 people were displaced. Houston, the 4th largest city in the United States, looked like a lake. The Navy and its supporting maritime forces mobilized immediately. FEMA activated training ships, the Military Sealift Command deployed assets, and the Department of Defense surged thousands of personnel into the region. Navy helicopters flew search and rescue missions over flooded neighborhoods, plucking survivors off rooftops in the kind of scenes that look like something from a disaster movie but were absolutely, terribly real. But Harvey was only the beginning. Before the response to Harvey had even fully stabilized, Hurricane Irma was forming in the Atlantic. And Irma was a monster. By peak intensity, it would become the strongest Atlantic hurricane ever recorded by wind speed, with peak winds reaching 185 miles per hour. It struck the U.S. Virgin Islands on September 6th, crippling infrastructure and leaving entire communities stranded without food or clean water. It then bore down on Florida, forcing the evacuation of millions of people and causing catastrophic damage across the state. The United States Navy moved assets into position immediately. USNS Spearhead, an expeditionary fast transport ship, positioned in Martinique to support humanitarian aid and disaster relief efforts in the areas hit by Irma. Navy helicopters and logistics teams worked around the clock. And then, while the response to Irma was still ongoing, Hurricane Maria hit. Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico on September 20th, 2017, as a Category 4 hurricane. It was the first Category 4 storm to make landfall on the main island of Puerto Rico in 85 years. And what it did to the island was, in the words of Puerto Rican officials, apocalyptic. The entire electrical grid of Puerto Rico failed. Every single power line, every transformer, every substation, gone. 3.4 million American citizens were suddenly without electricity, without running water, without communications, without almost everything. In some mountain communities, roads were completely washed away. People were entirely isolated. In rural areas, entire communities had no idea if help was coming. Some of them would wait months. The United States Navy responded with a deployment of ships that was unprecedented for a domestic disaster response. USS Wasp, USS Kearsarge, USS Oak Hill were initially sent to the region. The 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit embarked and deployed as well. And then, on September 29th, USNS Comfort, the Navy's famous hospital ship, departed Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia, and set course for Puerto Rico. USNS Comfort is not a small vessel. She is as long as 3 football fields and as tall as a 10-story building. She carries 12 operating rooms for X-ray units, a CAT scan unit, a dental suite, physical therapy facilities, a pharmacy, and a capacity for 1,000 patients. She was built to be a floating hospital. And when she arrived in Puerto Rico in October of 2017, she began doing exactly that. Navy MH-60S Seahawk helicopters from Helicopter Sea Combat Squadron 22 flew patients from inland hospitals that were overwhelmed or non-functional directly to Comfort's deck. Puerto Rican medical professionals joined the Navy teams on board. One powerful image that circulated at the time showed sailors transferring a patient from Menonita Hospital in Caguas, Puerto Rico, via helicopter directly to the ship's medical deck. It was medicine in motion. It was the Navy doing what it was built to do. The 26 Marine Expeditionary Unit's helicopters flew supply runs over the mountains and into communities that roads could not reach. Helicopters brought clean water, food, medicine, and communication equipment to neighborhoods that had been completely silent since the storm. But Puerto Rico also revealed something important. The scale of this disaster, the complexity of providing sustained assistance to an island of 3.4 million people with no power and severely damaged infrastructure, pushed the limits of what even the United States Navy's humanitarian mission could accomplish quickly. FEMA later described its response to Puerto Rico as the largest and longest single response in the agency's history. Congress eventually appropriated more than $12 billion for Hurricane Maria response and recovery in Puerto Rico alone. The 2017 hurricane season collectively affected more than 28 million people across Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. It produced 3 of the 5 costliest hurricanes in United States history. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimated that cumulative damages from all weather-related disasters in the United States in 2017 exceeded $300 billion. And through all of it, every single day, United States Navy ships, helicopters, sailors, and hospital personnel were out there, flying supply runs in the dark, performing surgery in ship operating rooms while anchored off hurricane-ravaged coasts, purifying water and handing it to families who had none. The The 2017 hurricane season was the ultimate test of the Navy's humanitarian capabilities in domestic waters. And the Navy passed that test, imperfectly in some respects, as all human endeavors are imperfect, but with extraordinary dedication and effort. Chapter 3. The Floating Hospitals, Pacific Partnership and Continued Pacific Presence, 2015 to 2019. While most Americans were paying attention to hurricanes and earthquakes, the United States Navy was also quietly, consistently doing something remarkable in the Pacific Ocean year after year. Since 2004, the Navy has run a humanitarian mission program called Pacific Partnership. Every year, one of the Navy's hospital ships, either USNS Mercy or USNS Comfort, deploys to the Pacific and visits nations across Southeast Asia, Oceania, and the Indo-Pacific region, providing medical care, engineering assistance, and community service to populations that have limited access to health care. USNS Mercy is the older of the two hospital ships. She is a converted San Clemente-class supertanker, rebuilt in the late 1980s at a cost of $550 million, fitted out as a fully functional floating hospital. Her partner, USNS Comfort, is identical in design. Together, these two ships represent something truly unique in naval history. A dedicated floating hospital fleet operated by military power that spends more time healing civilians than treating combat casualties. In 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019, Pacific Partnership missions continued annually, deploying medical teams, dentists, optometrists, surgeons, and engineers to nations including the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and others across the region. These missions are not just about handing out medicine. They build relationships. When the United States Navy sails into a harbor and provides free surgeries to children who have never seen a doctor, when sailors repair schools and build water systems in villages that have nothing, it changes how those communities see America. It builds trust that no amount of diplomatic language or military posturing can replicate. It says in the most direct and practical language possible, America cares about you. One senior naval officer who commanded an amphibious ready group during a Pacific humanitarian mission described it this way. Many people told him that now that they saw the Navy there, they knew America cared. That is not just good foreign policy. That is a human connection. And those human connections, built one mission at a time, one surgery at a time, one repaired school roof at a time, have lasting effects on America's relationships across the Asia-Pacific region. The Pacific Partnership missions also serve as training opportunities. Sailors and medical personnel practice the kind of logistics, coordination, and real-world medical care that directly improves their ability to respond when the next disaster strikes. Between 1970 and the year 2000, the United States was involved in over 366 humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions. That is compared to just 22 combat missions over the same period. Think about that for a moment. The ratio of humanitarian missions to combat missions for the United States military is not even close. The United States Navy has spent far more of its operational history helping than it has spent fighting. Chapter 4. The Pandemic Response. USNS Comfort and USNS Mercy, 2020. And then came 2020. In early March of that year, a word that most Americans had never heard before began appearing everywhere. Coronavirus. COVID-19. A respiratory virus of extraordinary contagion that was spreading from country to country with terrifying speed. On March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared it a global pandemic. Within days, hospitals in New York City were filling up. Projections warned that the city's entire medical system could be overwhelmed within weeks. The scenes coming out of New York were devastating. Emergency rooms packed beyond capacity. Doctors and nurses working without adequate protective equipment. Refrigerated trucks brought in to serve as temporary morgues. The city that never sleeps was grinding to a horrified halt. President Trump and Defense Secretary Esper made the call. Deploy the hospital ships. On March 23, 2020, Secretary Esper stood at the Pentagon podium and made the announcement. USNS Mercy was deployed to Los Angeles, and USNS Comfort would be deploying to New York City within 2 weeks. The reaction across America was immediate and emotional. People cried when they heard the news. When USNS Comfort came sailing up the Hudson River on March 30th, 2020, passing the Statue of Liberty on her way to Pier 90 in Manhattan, New Yorkers who had been sheltering in their apartments came to their windows and cheered. They took videos on their phones. They wept. One of the most powerful images of the entire pandemic in America is that photograph of USNS Comfort, with her Red Cross markings and her brilliant white hull, passing Lady Liberty on a gray March morning. It was a symbol of hope in one of the darkest moments the city had seen since September 11th. USNS Mercy arrived at the port of Los Angeles on March 27th. Her mission, identical to Comfort's in New York, was to serve as what the Navy called a relief valve. She would take in patients with non-COVID conditions, surgical emergencies, trauma cases, heart attacks, appendicitis, all the medical crises that don't stop just because there is a pandemic. By taking those patients, she would free up land-based hospitals to focus entirely on COVID patients. Both ships were massive medical facilities. Each had space for 1,000 patients and carried nearly 1,300 medical personnel, including active duty sailors, Navy Reserve doctors and nurses, and civilian medical staff. 12 operating rooms, ICU beds, all the equipment of a top-tier trauma hospital. USNS Comfort had 500 beds active during the mission, including 80 intensive care unit beds. She carried a fully equipped invasive angiography suite, oxygen-producing plants, a full pharmacy, and dental facilities. When the ship opened her gangway and began accepting patients, her commanders told the public simply, "We are here. We are ready. Come if you need us." There was frustration in some quarters that the ships did not fill up as quickly as expected. USNS Mercy treated a total of 77 patients during her time in Los Angeles before departing on May 15th. USNS Comfort treated 182 patients in New York before returning to Norfolk on May 2nd. Critics pointed to these relatively low numbers as signs of failure. But military analysts and medical professionals pushed back on that criticism, and their counterargument is important. The ship's real value was not just in the patients they treated. It was in what they represented, a massive, ready reserve of medical capacity that the city could call on at any moment. If the projections had been right and New York hospitals had been overwhelmed, Comfort was there. The knowledge that those ships were in the harbor changed the psychology of the crisis. It was a safety net, and the fact that the safety net wasn't needed at full capacity doesn't mean you shouldn't have built it. If things had gone bad, said one professor and former merchant mariner, Comfort and Mercy being there gives you the cushion that you'd want. The best thing in the world is that they don't fill up with patients. There were additional complications during the missions. 5 crew members aboard USNS Comfort tested positive for COVID-19. A freight train in Los Angeles was intentionally derailed near the dock where USNS Mercy was berthed in what officials described as a bizarre criminal act. Rules about which patients could be transferred to the ships had to be revised in real time as the situation evolved. Vice Admiral Andrew Lewis, commander of U.S. Second Fleet, authorized the ships to begin taking patients regardless of their COVID status, saying that getting patients onto the ship as quickly as possible was critical to helping New York during its pandemic crisis. The COVID deployments of Mercy and Comfort were not perfect operations. They were improvised, urgent, emotionally charged responses to a crisis that nobody had a playbook for. But they demonstrated, once again, that when America faces a catastrophe at home, the United States Navy can and will show up. With hospital ships, with thousands of medical professionals, with the capacity to provide care when civilian systems are strained beyond their limits. The naval personnel who served on those ships during the pandemic described the experience with deep pride. One neurosurgeon and one anesthesiologist who served as Navy Reserve Medical Corps officers on USNS Mercy wrote afterward that the most impressive asset they saw during the entire mobilization was not the ship itself and not the technology. It was the people, ready to serve, ready to show up, ready to sail wherever they were needed and do whatever was required. Chapter 5. The machines that make it possible. Navy capabilities and assets. Let's step back for a moment and talk about what actually makes all of this possible. Because when people hear about Navy disaster response, they picture sailors on ships handing out water. And yes, that happens. But the reality of what the United States Navy brings to a disaster zone is something far more complex and far more powerful. First, there is the unique advantage of naval logistics. When a disaster strikes, roads are often destroyed, airports are overwhelmed or damaged, and land-based supply chains collapse. The ocean is none of those things. A Navy ship can anchor off a disaster-struck coast and operate completely independently for weeks at a time. It generates its own power. Its helicopters can reach areas that no vehicle can access. Its water purification systems can produce tens of thousands of gallons of clean drinking water every day. It carries its own fuel, its own food, its own medical supplies. It is, in the language of military planners, a self-sustaining forward operating base that can park itself right next to the people who need help most. The Navy's hospital ships, Mercy and Comfort, are the most visible examples of this capability. Each ship is as long as 3 football fields. Each carries 12 operating rooms, hundreds of beds, and full surgical, medical, and trauma care capabilities. They were originally built to treat wounded military personnel in wartime. But as we have seen, they have spent most of their service lives doing something different, treating civilians in peacetime. Then there are the amphibious assault ships. Vessels like USS Wasp, USS Kearsarge, and USS Bataan are each large enough to carry a full Marine expeditionary unit with its helicopters, landing craft, equipment, and supplies. When a hurricane or earthquake hits, these ships become floating command centers, helicopter bases, and supply depots all in one. Their flight decks can operate dozens of helicopters simultaneously, flying continuous sorties to deliver food, water, and medicine to areas that nothing else can reach. The Navy's helicopter fleet is particularly critical in disaster response. The MH-60SE Hawk is the workhorse of Navy humanitarian operations. These helicopters can fly in almost any weather, carry significant loads of supplies, perform water rescues, hoist survivors from rooftops and debris, and operate from ship decks in the middle of the ocean. During every major disaster we have discussed in this documentary, MH-60S helicopters were among the first American assets on the scene. The MV-22B Osprey, which we saw so dramatically in Nepal, is another revolutionary asset. Because it combines the vertical takeoff and landing capability of a helicopter with the speed and range of a fixed-wing aircraft, the Osprey can reach remote locations that no other aircraft can access. In the mountains of Nepal, where altitude and terrain made conventional helicopter operations extraordinarily dangerous, the Osprey was what made the difference between reaching people and leaving them to die. The Navy's expeditionary fast transport ships, vessels like USNS Spearhead, are another critical capability. These catamaran-hulled ships are fast, shallow-drafted, and enormously versatile. They can carry vehicles, equipment, and supplies into ports and bays that larger Navy vessels cannot enter. They can be loaded in hours rather than days. In the Caribbean after Hurricane Irma, USNS Spearhead was one of the first American naval assets on scene. And behind all of this is the Military Sea Lift Command, the logistical backbone of United States naval operations. The Military Sea Lift Command operates the hospital ships, the cargo ships, the fuel ships, and dozens of other specialized vessels that keep the Navy's humanitarian and combat operations running. Without the Military Sea Lift Command, none of the missions we have discussed would be possible. Chapter 6. The Doctrine and the People. How the Navy prepares. Military operations do not just happen. They happen because thousands of people have trained, planned, written doctrine, run exercises, and learned from past mistakes. The United States Navy's humanitarian assistance and disaster relief capability is one of the most studied, most documented, and most carefully refined areas of military operations in the world. The Navy operates under a framework called HADR, which stands for Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief. This framework covers everything from how the Navy activates in response to a disaster to how it coordinates with civilian agencies like FEMA and USAID, to how it manages logistics, to how it hands off operations to civilian organizations once the immediate crisis has passed. When a foreign disaster strikes, the process moves quickly. The Secretary of Defense appoints the commander of the relevant geographic combatant command as the lead military organization. That commander can then create or activate a joint task force to plan and execute the HADR mission. The Joint Task Force commander coordinates with the Department of State and USAID through the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. That office is the critical link between the military and the civilian humanitarian response system. At the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, there's an entire division called the College of Maritime Operational Warfare's Office of Military Assistance to Disaster Response Operations. This office runs courses for fleet commanders, partners with civilian universities and humanitarian organizations, and conducts research specifically designed to improve how the Navy responds to disasters. They run simulation exercises. They study past operations. They figure out what went wrong and how to do it better. It is an ongoing, never-ending process of learning and refinement. The Navy Tactical Task Manual, specifically NTP 3 to 57.3, is a comprehensive reference document that guides naval commanders through every phase of humanitarian and civic assistance operations. It covers training requirements, information sharing protocols, command and control procedures, and logistics planning in enormous detail. Logistics is the largest chapter in that manual, which tells you something important about what actually makes or breaks a humanitarian mission. Getting the right supplies to the right place at the right time, using ships and helicopters and cargo aircraft working together, is the hardest and most critical part of any disaster response. Researchers at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, have spent years analyzing which types of Navy vessels are most effective for different types of disasters. A carrier strike group, which typically includes an aircraft carrier, at least one cruiser, 2 destroyers, and approximately 7,500 personnel and 65 aircraft, brings enormous air capability but is best suited for large-scale disasters with good access. Amphibious assault ships are often the most effective all-purpose disaster response platform because of their combination of helicopter capability, vehicle transport, and logistics capacity. Hospital ships are critical for disasters involving mass casualties or overwhelmed civilian medical systems. The analysis consistently shows one thing. There is no single perfect asset for every disaster. The best results come from combining assets, matching capabilities to specific needs, and coordinating military and civilian responders under clear unified command structures. And critically, the Navy has recognized that HADR is not a secondary mission. It is not something sailors do when there is nothing else going on. It is a core mission. It is declared as such in United States national security strategy. Between 1970 and the year 2000, American military forces were involved in over 366 humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions. That is more than one per month, every month for 30 years. The ratio of humanitarian missions to combat missions is roughly 17-1. The United States military, and particularly the United States Navy, does more humanitarian work than it does fighting. That is not an opinion. That is the data. Chapter 7. The Human Faces, Stories from Sailors. Numbers tell a story. Statistics tell a story. But the most powerful story is always the human one. And in every one of the missions we have discussed, there are human faces. There are sailors who were scared. There are doctors who worked through the night. There are pilots who flew into weather they should not have survived. There are young men and women from small towns in Kansas and big cities in California who found themselves in Nepal or Puerto Rico or on a ship deck in the Hudson River and rose to something they did not know they had. Consider the Navy Reserve Medical Corps officers who were called up and deployed to USNS Mercy and USNS Comfort during the COVID-19 pandemic. These were doctors and nurses who had day jobs at civilian hospitals, academic medical centers, and private practices. They left their families, their practices, their normal lives, answered the call, boarded a ship, and went to sea in the middle of a pandemic. One of them was a neurosurgeon. Another was an anesthesiologist. Both wrote later about their profound pride in their shipmates, about the remarkable quality of care they witnessed, about the grand rounds presentations that doctors from entirely different backgrounds gave each other out of a genuine desire to learn and share. They called the experience one of the most meaningful of their professional lives. And they were clear about one thing. The most valuable asset on those ships was not the equipment. It was the people. Consider the families of the 6 Marines and 2 Nepalese soldiers who died in Nepal on May 12, 2015, when their helicopter went down in the mountains near Cheriko. Those families received the worst possible news any military family can receive. Their loved ones were gone. And not in combat, not defending a front line or taking a hilltop. They were delivering food and medicine to earthquake survivors in the mountains of Nepal. They were trying to help. And the people of Nepal, who were themselves in the middle of catastrophe, found the heart to write an open letter to the world expressing their grief and their gratitude for those lives. That letter was shared around the world. It made grown men cry, because it captured something true and beautiful about what those sailors and Marines were doing in Nepal. They gave their lives trying to help strangers on the other side of the world. And those strangers knew it. And they said, thank you. Think about what it means to be a sailor on USS Kearsarge during Hurricane Maria's aftermath. Your ship is anchored off the coast of Puerto Rico. You are looking at an island that has been torn apart. The lights are out everywhere. You can see how dark it is from the ship. There are no lights. Almost none, just darkness from coast to coast. And your job, day after day, is to fly supplies into that darkness, into the mountains, into the remote valleys, into the communities that nobody else can reach. You do this knowing that somewhere out there, a family is waiting. An elderly man needs insulin. A child needs clean water. A mother needs medicine for a sick baby. You do not know their names. You will never meet them, but you fly anyway. Every day, you fly anyway. That is the human face of Navy humanitarian response. Chapter 8, Lessons Learned and Looking Forward, 2020 to 2025. Every major humanitarian mission teaches something. And the United States Navy, to its credit, has built systems specifically designed to capture those lessons and use them to do better next time. After the 2017 hurricane season, military and civilian agencies together conducted exhaustive after-action reviews. FEMA published a detailed report identifying what worked, what did not, and what needed to change. The Navy's own after-action systems captured operational insights from every mission, from the logistics challenges of operating in Puerto Rico's mountainous terrain to the communications gaps that slowed the early response after Hurricane Maria. One of the most consistent lessons across all disaster response operations in this decade is the critical importance of pre-positioning. The Navy ships that got to Puerto Rico fastest after Hurricane Maria were the ones that were already in the region or that had staged in advance of the storm. The Osprey aircraft in Nepal were from Marine units already operating in Okinawa, Japan, ready to launch on short notice. Pre-positioning forces close to regions at high risk of natural disasters dramatically reduces response time. And in a disaster, time is lives. A second consistent lesson is the importance of civil-military coordination. The military is extraordinarily capable, but it is not designed to replace civilian aid organizations or civilian government. The most effective disaster responses in the last decade have been those where the military provided the logistical backbone, the airlift capacity, the water purification, the security, and the initial shock-absorbing capacity, while civilian organizations took the lead on community assessment, long-term recovery planning, and the complex social work of rebuilding broken lives. When those two worlds work well together, remarkable things happen. When they work poorly together, the suffering is prolonged. A third lesson is that island and coastal geographies present unique challenges that favor naval response assets over almost anything else. Whether it is Puerto Rico, the Philippines, or the island nations of the Pacific, the combination of distance from mainland supply chains, vulnerable coastal infrastructure, and difficult interior terrain makes naval forces uniquely valuable. The ability to park a hospital ship or an amphibious assault ship directly off the coast, operate helicopters from its deck, and sustain operations independently for weeks without depending on roads or airports is something no other type of military or humanitarian organization can replicate. From 2020 through 2025, the Navy continued to evolve its humanitarian capabilities. Pacific Partnership missions continued, adapting to COVID-related restrictions and then resuming with enhanced protocols. The Navy worked to modernize its hospital ships, with both Mercy and Comfort aging into their fourth decade of service and discussions ongoing about what the next generation of naval medical platforms might look like. New expeditionary fast transport vessels and updated amphibious ships continued to join the fleet, each with lessons learned from past disasters built into their design and their operational plans. The Navy also began investing more in preparedness partnerships, working with civilian universities, international humanitarian organizations, and partner nation militaries to build the networks and share protocols that make coordinated disaster responses faster and more effective. The Naval War College's Humanitarian Response Program expanded its reach, training commanders and staffs, not just from the American military, but from allied and partner militaries around the world. And through all of these changes, one thing remained constant. Whenever a disaster struck, wherever in the world the earth shook, or the storm came ashore, or the pandemic overwhelmed the hospitals, the United States Navy showed up. With ships and helicopters and doctors and sailors. With water and food and medicine and hope. Always. Every time. Chapter 9. The bigger picture. Why this matters. Let's take a step back for a moment from the specific operations and the specific ships and think about the bigger picture. Why does any of this matter? Why should Americans care about the United States Navy's humanitarian mission? Why should taxpayers who fund this capability feel pride in it? The answer is both simple and profound. The United States Navy is the most powerful naval force in the history of the world. It operates in every ocean simultaneously. It projects power that no other nation can match. And for generations, the primary way that power was understood and feared was through its combat capability. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines that can strike any target on Earth. But there's another kind of power. Soft power, in the language of foreign policy. The power of being needed. The power of being trusted. The power of showing up when people are in their worst moment and helping them. The United States Navy's humanitarian operations are a form of soft power so consistent, so reliable, and so genuinely felt by the people it serves that they have shaped American relationships with dozens of nations over decades. When the United States sends a hospital ship to a Pacific island nation for Pacific Partnership, when American Navy surgeons remove cataract from elderly villagers who have been slowly going blind, when Navy engineers repair the roof of a school that typhoon winds tore apart, something happens. Something real. The children who go back to that school, the elder who can see clearly for the first time in years, the parents who watch Navy doctors take care of their children, they do not forget. They carry that experience. It shapes how they see America. It shapes how their leaders, when those children grow up, think about the United States. This is not naivety. It is strategic reality. Militaries that only fight, that only threaten, that only appear in crisis regions as an occupying or combat force, generate resentment and fear. Militaries that also show up in disaster zones, that also build water systems and provide surgeries and deliver food, generate something different. Gratitude, trust, partnership. The United States Navy's humanitarian mission is not charity. It is not sentimentality. It is a strategic investment in America's standing in the world that pays dividends that are difficult to measure, but absolutely real. And beyond the geopolitics, there is something even simpler at its heart. When a child is trapped in an earthquake, when an elderly woman is stranded on a flooded rooftop, when a father is searching for his family in the ruins of a typhoon-struck village, those people need help. And the United States Navy can help them. The technology, the capability, the reach, the logistics, the courage. It is there. It exists. And in the best tradition of American values, of American generosity, of the idea that power carries with it responsibility, it is used. Not perfectly, not without failures and frustrations and bureaucratic slowness and political complications, but used consistently for a decade, for longer. Chapter 10, The Legacy and the Promise, Closing. We began this story on a rooftop, a family trapped by floodwaters, the water rising, and then a helicopter, a sound in the gray sky, and on the side of that helicopter, 3 words: United States Navy. Through 10 years of devastating earthquakes and catastrophic hurricanes, through a global pandemic, through typhoons and floods, and the 1,000 other ways the natural world reminds us how fragile we are, the United States Navy has been that sound in the sky. That helicopter coming. That ship on the horizon with a red cross on her white hull. In Nepal in 2015, 6 Marines and 2 Nepalese soldiers gave their lives flying food and medicine to strangers in the mountains. Their sacrifice is a permanent, powerful reminder that humanitarian service is not without cost. It is not without danger. The men and women who fly those helicopters and crew those ships are not just doing a job. They are, in the truest sense of the word, serving. In Puerto Rico in 2017, thousands of American sailors worked for weeks to provide relief to 3.4 million fellow citizens who were left in the dark by one of the worst hurricanes in a century. It was imperfect. It was hard. There were failures and delays and things that should have gone better. But they were there, day after day, flying into the mountains with water, treating patients on a hospital ship anchored off the coast, doing the work. In New York City in 2020, USNS Comfort sailed up the Hudson River past the Statue of Liberty, and New Yorkers who had been terrified and isolated by a pandemic they did not understand came to their windows and cheered. Because in that moment, that ship was not just a military asset. It was a promise that says, you are not alone. America has not forgotten you. Help is here. This is the legacy of a decade of United States Navy humanitarian operations. It is written in the memories of survivors and the gratitude of nations. It is written in the lessons learned and the doctrines refined and the capabilities improved. It is written in the names of those who gave their lives in service of others, not on a battlefield, but on a hillside in Nepal, in a helicopter that went down in the dark. And it is a promise that continues. Because as long as there are earthquakes and hurricanes and pandemics and typhoons, as long as the natural world tests us beyond our capacity to endure alone, as long as there are people stranded on rooftops and children without clean water and communities broken by disaster, the United States Navy will be out there, sailing toward the need, flying toward the sound of suffering, showing up. That is who they are. That is what they do. And that is a story that every American should know. Thank you for listening.